Well, thank you for coming to our second in our lecture series of talks on building a just, or perils and promise of building a just and sustainable future. And of course, you know, China is having a huge impact on the world today and will in the future. And so we have an expert. Terry Weidner, the director of the Mansfield Center, has been thinking about China, he served in both the political realm and the academic realm for over 35 years. He's been thinking about these things. And we're very pleased to have Terry here to talk to us about our flawed China policy. So give him a welcome.
Thank you for coming to sit in this dark, hot room on a glorious fall day. I mean, I know what I'm doing here, but I don't know what you're doing here, so thank you for your poor judgment. I'm really happy to be here presenting a talk for the Practical Ethics Center. As at least some in the room know, the Mansfield Center was originally conceived as having not just an East Asian component, but an ethical component. And many years ago, there was sort of a splitting of the ways, and although the center itself maintained an ethical focus, the actual collaboration with the experts on ethics has sort of fallen by the wayside. So my hope is that today starts a new beginning. Dane and I will talk afterwards about other ways we can collaborate. This is certainly something that's very important to me. And you know, this title is one of those things where I was asked to give a title when I had 20 other things going on. And so I gave one, wondering what I would say. And maybe I'm still wondering. But probably the title is a misnomer in that the motives may not be flawed, but the policy is. So we'll see where I go. And again, I guess I decided to talk about ethics as a dimension of foreign policy because among the things I don't know, it's like 14th instead of 27th. And so I'm speaking today as someone who is not an expert on U.S. foreign policy, even toward China. And so but it's been good because it's sort of forced me to figure out what I think. And what I'll do is just share some of those thoughts and, with luck, provoke some corrections or at least discussion. I should, in terms of honesty, I should say that as I thought about it, ethical foreign policy seemed to me to be an oxymoron, that most foreign policy, it seems to me, is created out of self-interest, and I'm not sure that that's a bad thing. And in fact, the United States may be somewhat rare in pretending that what we do is altruistic. I mean, we invade countries not to get their oil, but to save their democracies. We protect people from terrorists, even if we have to kill them. So I mention that up front to show you that I have a very strong bias here. I'm very cynical about most things. And I'm incredibly cynical about U.S. foreign policy. So with that little blast, it's sort of a warning that filter everything I say, knowing my biases. Actually, in talking about U.S. foreign policy toward China, we may be talking about a set of policies where ethics, and I guess in simplest terms, that just means our felt need to do something good, may be a greater driving force than in our foreign policy toward virtually any other country. And it's that way for reasons I don't completely understand myself. It's just that for a set of historical and other circumstances, the United States has not only, over many, many, many decades, developed a special interest in China, but a sense of moral purpose toward China. My guess is that it started in the mid-19th century with U.S. missionaries beginning to go to China. If you've ever had the chance to read some of the diaries or personal letters of U.S. China missionaries, you'll see, I mean, I was amazed when I first read them. They're filled with vitriol. It's like, these bastards, don't they know that they should embrace God? So on the one hand, privately, there was a deep sense of sort of disgust and disappointment. On the other hand, these same missionaries sent letters to church parishes, thousands and tens of thousands of church parishes over many, many, many years, sort of making China human to them. not just talking about the need to save souls, but the need to save China from poverty, and depicting them as sort of a noble, beleaguered people that needed material help, among other things. And I think that may have been the beginning of a tendency of the United States to think about China when we don't think about other countries, that in its huge size and civilization and so forth. And so we see a felt need to sort of protect China in some way or another, already as part of formal U.S. policy by 1898. This was the time of so-called scramble for concessions in China. European powers had been deeply involved in China, and in 1895, China lost a war to a former vassal state in Japan, and this sort of triggered a response among the Europeans. Oh my God, this place is going to collapse. We got to get our peace before the whole thing goes to hell. And so there was literally a scramble to create colonies and to run China economically, militarily, politically. The United States at this time had not yet fought the Spanish-American War, and thus did not have a foothold in Asia that we were later to have in the Philippines. And so, I mean, the best we could do then was to try to keep the Europeans from getting all the goodies and leaving us on the outside. And so we announced a policy called the open door policy, which we tried to get the Europeans to agree that none of their colonies would be closed to other international interests. So, I mean, most American diplomatic historians agree that this was, you know, a very utilitarian, self-serving policy. But the way it was portrayed for the public was the United States moving in and saving China from these voracious Europeans. And in fact, there's a very famous picture that was republished many, many, many times, where Uncle Sam in caricature is like this, holding back Huns and other low-life Europeans, right? So already by 1898, then, we were creating a public sort of impression that we are the protectors of China, and that our interests are noble, not like those other guys. Okay. So this kind of protector attitude became part of Americans' mindset in small but very important ways for decades after that. I still remember when I was a kid being told that some poor kid in China would be grateful for those beans I was refusing to eat, right? And I also remember being raised as a Catholic, hearing virtually every year about some major campaign to raise goods to send to Chinese refugees in Hong Kong. So again, it was not just a sort of general public sense of China, but it was deeply embedded in the religious community in the United States as well. Now, to be sure, there were many sort of countervailing public images, you know, the Fu Manchu, the yellow hordes. During the years of yellow journalism, the pulp journalism, you know, the 1920s equivalent of Space Invaders make pact with Oprah to lose weight, that sort of thing. There were an ongoing theme of long fingernailed Manchu Chinese coveting our women. You know, all of that strain runs through the American public domain through all this time. But the message of a China in need and the U.S. as a special savior survived through the entire last century. A classic example of this is Pearl Buck's book, which was made into a movie called The Good Earth, which portrayed China as other images did, as sort of a heroic, noble, simple people who deserved to be saved and who were just like us, except that they had tyrannical leaders. And that made them all the more appealing as objects of savior. And we saw them as being like us all the more because in this movie and in countless other sort of media images, they used American actors to play all the Chinese, not Chinese. Early Charlie Chan, same thing. It was an American with eyes pulled back. So the linkage between our two sides was reinforced between the 1920s and the 1950s by political events and U.S. policy, specifically in the way we portrayed Chiang Kai-shek. Those of you who are old enough, you'll know that we sort of anointed Chiang Kai-shek as a democratic savior of China. And this is logical in many ways because he was a Christian. His wife was a Wellesley graduate who was sort of the Jackie Onassis of her time. Very debonair, spoke perfect English, very stylish, knew how to say all the right things. And so for that reason alone, it was easy to make Chiang Kai-shek the first in a series of dictators who we could pretend held our values. Okay? And Chiang was really astute enough to sort of promote this. And he made friends with the Luce family and other media magnates who helped to portray Chiang in the most flattering possible way. But this was, our feeling about Chiang Kai-shek was sort of inclined to be very favorable, was cemented by a very conscious U.S. policy to glorify him as a Democrat. It was done for a very simple reason, that while we were fighting Hitler, there was much less interest in fighting the Japanese in Asia. I mean, that was second on our list, and we desperately needed China to sort of tie down the Japanese until we had time to turn to that war front. And so we did it by a huge propaganda campaign to make Chiang Kai-shek into the good Christian democratic soul that we wanted to support in China. I still remember a Frank Capra made movie for the War Department. He did a lot of propaganda films during World War II, and in which it was, you know, two great civilizations fighting for the same cause, democracy in China, you know, music rises in the background. So all of this sort of ignored the reality. I mean, in truth, Chiang Kai-shek was a warlord who held very traditional authoritarian values. And we found it very sort of uncomfortable when it turned out that he wasn't really a reformer. And even though we kept throwing money at him, he was disinclined to become a reformer. And he ultimately even refused to fight the Japanese. And he also did things that we had to hush-hush, like allowing 100,000 people to starve to death in Hunan province because the guy running the province was one of his enemies. Routinely skinned the opposition alive in public squares, you know, to send a political message. This is not the sort of thing that a Democrat does, but virtually none of this ever crept into American media. So the predominant feeling then, for years and years and years, even when Chiang Kai-shek went to Taiwan, was Chiang as the Democrat. And so as China was a democracy, so Taiwan became a democracy. I lived in Taiwan in the 70s, and I can tell you, I've never lived in a more oppressive place in my life. I mean, people disappeared. If your hair was too long, you got thrown in jail. You know, if you said peep against the government, you were screwed. So what it meant, though, was that despite the reality, we had created an image about Chiang Kai-shek that sort of overlay our image of China, and that it shared goals with us. It was a noble people. We're fighting for the same thing. We need to protect these guys. And what we did was to lock ourselves into a position where politically we had no recourse. I mean, there was a brief effort in 1944 at a time of enormous disgust with Chiang Kai-shek because he wasn't fighting, to take a serious look at the Chinese communists who were growing hand over fist. And Chiang simply started screaming to his friends in Congress, and that was the end of it. So when Chiang lost a civil war to the Chinese Communist forces, it was not only inconceivable to us, but it seemed like it had to involve deceit. And so we get into the who lost China nonsense that goes on through the McCarthy era and beyond. So and you know, and then when Mao Zedong came to become ruler of China, and was by almost any definition, including the Chinese, sort of a monster by the end of his tenure, we had all the more reason to see China as something that needs to be saved. Okay? So this sense of special, the fact that this sense of special connection lasted until 1970s is apparent in the hoo-ha that arose after Henry Kissinger's secret trip to China in 1971. You remember that this is in the midst of the Chinese Cultural Revolution, which makes it amazing. And it reflects the fact that the Chinese are very pragmatic in foreign policy. This was a time in which, despite the fact the United States was the great Satan in their minds, the Soviet Union was a greater foreign policy threat. And so they simply made a decision to send a message to the United States: we are interested. And luckily, we had someone in the U.S. presidency, Richard Nixon, who could never be called soft on communism. And so he had an opportunity and took advantage. And so what we see after Kissinger's secret trip in 1971 is the visit of the Chinese ping pong team. And all of this subliminal sort of sense of goodwill toward China came to the fore. I was a graduate student then, and all of a sudden China became important. I was at Michigan, and the ping pong team came to Ann Arbor, and I remember it for two things. One, my roommate's cousin was Connie Chung, so I got to meet Connie. Sephora Mori, so she was hot then. She was also about this high. And the fact that people who hate ping pong went bananas over ping pong. We had 18,000 people in Chrysler Arena watching this ping pong team, right? So this shows that, rightly or wrongly, the U.S.-China relationship isn't really normal. The good news is that there is this sense of special bond between the two that allowed us to sort of forget decades of vitriol and become friends, at least at a people-to-people level. The bad news from the Chinese perspective is that we have a double standard. Chinese will tell you that we meddle in their affairs far more than we meddle in the affairs of any other nation. And I tell them, yes, I agree, but be careful what you ask for. I said, you could be from India, glorious civilization, huge population, emerging market economy, strategically important, even increasingly democratic. And we don't care. I mean, nobody cares about India, but China, big deal. So what I'm going to do against this backdrop is to talk about some of the aspects, some of the issues in U.S.-China relations, and to sort of tease out whether the extent to which there is an ethical dimension at work here or not. And I think we'll find that these issues are like real life, and that is that they are complicated, they're contradictory. There are some policies which have been launched for ethical reasons, ostensibly, but they've either become downright hypocritical. At the very least, we ultimately seem to be acting in more narrow interests. And it's done on an issue-by-issue basis, clearly, but I think in talking about some of these, we'll see a theme that, from my perspective at least, although we firmly believe that we are following an ethical standard with the Chinese, that more often than not, self-interest emerges triumphant. So ethical questions in U.S.-China policy are most obvious, of course, and therefore the greatest sore spot in the realm of human rights. And this is an area where we really started paying attention in the early 80s. The tension on this issue stems from several reasons, and a lot of them are very, very obvious. First and foremost, of course, is the fact that there have been a long string of Chinese leaders that have been very oppressive and have rankled when the United States points this out. I mean, I happen to be in the camp that if you're oppressive, deal with it. It's our right to bring it up. And if it's uncomfortable for you, look in the mirror, okay? So I am not someone who thinks that we should not pay attention to human rights in China. Rather, I think that we should pay attention to human rights in many other places, like Saudi Arabia, for example. But even on the human rights issue, we see real complexities, and often in ways that undercut the impact of U.S. policy. One, we come from very different cultures. And in China, like it or not, human rights are still defined very differently than they are defined here. We typically define human rights in terms of political freedoms, and most particularly in terms of individual freedoms. In China, as a result of centuries of economic deprivation and a tradition that is bereft of any democratic tradition, the Chinese have long defined human rights first and foremost in economic terms. The right to survive, most fundamentally. But as China has become more prosperous, the right to have a job, to take care of your kids, to give them an opportunity, to provide them with the most possible opportunities. And this definition has persisted in part because it has been convenient for China's leaders, who have been oppressive politically, but at least at times, like during the Dengist reform and into the current period, have been much more effective at providing for the economic needs of the Chinese people. And one of the dilemmas now is that, as we'll see, the Chinese Communist Party's hold on power has become more and more threatened as people's lives have improved economically. So nevertheless, it remains a common ethos of the Chinese people to define human rights in economic terms. I mean, whether we like it or not, economic conditions are still more important to most Chinese than freedom. Okay. One of the things that most Americans do not know is that China has long sought to counter what it seems as U.S. interference in Chinese sovereign affairs by pointing out what it perceives as human rights violations in this country. In fact, for almost 20 years, as we have published formal reports that we give to the United Nations on human rights violations in China, China has produced its annual report on human rights violations in the United States. And if you talk to any Chinese about human rights, if we start ranking on Tibet, which is completely understandable, the Chinese will say, "Can you say Native American?" And we talk about something else, they say, "Let's talk about your African Americans." So, I mean, they do what is very easy to do, to point out that the emperor has no clothes, that they have problems, but please don't pretend that we don't have problems in the United States. But interestingly, the sort of Chinese focus on economic aspects of human rights often shows itself in different ways. I remember, as a graduate student, seeing some video that was all over Chinese television about conditions in the American ghetto. I mean, it was an obvious way to undercut our pressure on Chinese human rights at that time. And it showed, the most miserable apartments in Harlem that one can conceive of. Rats crawling all over, holes punched out, dirt and filth everywhere. Mothers trying to take care of 3 kids who barely had enough clothes to wear. And I remember thinking, my God, this must be pretty devastating and very effective for the Maoists. But I talked to Chinese friends about it later, and they said, "Oh no, it wasn't effective at all." They said, "You saw the filth and the holes in the wall and the rats. We saw the refrigerator." We said, "God, even they have refrigerators. What the hell's going on here?" So today, obviously, most Chinese do have refrigerators, and they have color TVs, and they have air conditioning, and they have nice apartments. But they also judge the U.S. by a tougher standard. And this is borne out clearly in the Katrina cleanup mess. I mean, China, the Chinese media joined the media of many, many other countries and sort of asking, how can a civilized, competent, advanced country do this horribly? Good question, right? But they were also very quick to point out the scenes of the people who were standing on their roofs and the obvious signs of poverty that were there long before Katrina. And saying, you know, how can you talk about moral values and have a segment of your population with your level of development that is living this badly? And so this persists in the Chinese sensibility as undercutting our moral authority on human rights. And you can see this Chinese perception of hypocrisy in many other contexts in our relationship. As I mentioned, the Chinese are miffed, if not more than miffed, at our willingness to turn a blind eye to human rights violations elsewhere. And many human rights conditions that are blatantly worse than in China. Okay. So that, the fact that the Chinese see themselves as singled out makes them less receptive to anything we tell them on human rights. There's also been a sustained bitterness at the U.S. focus on abortion. As you are no doubt aware, the United States for many, many years has refused to give support to the United Nations, UNICEF, World Health Organization, and other related UN organizations because they are involved in family planning operations in countries such as China. And you know, this, we all know the context of the story, and we know that it has been justified in the Chinese case by stories, at least some of which are true, about forced late-term abortions, even female infanticide. I mean, no one who knows China would ever say, these things don't exist. They do. I mean, it's a big country, and in the worst cases, there are horrible policies being carried out, but they are inevitably carried out by low-level local authorities, and they are in violation of a national standard. But you know, this is clearly an ethical question, and especially for many fundamentalist Christians, it's very important and supersedes a lot of other things. But from the Chinese perspective, you know, there are important questions to ask, like, if you're so concerned about abortion, how come you never say peep to the Japanese, who have the highest abortion rate in the world? How come you don't care about abortion in other places to the extent you care about it in China? How come, if you're so concerned about the conditions in China, you're not more willing to work with us to ameliorate those conditions? And so on and so on. But the final and most important question is, if you're so moral about abortion, how can you be so unconcerned about the hundreds of millions of Chinese kids who would have been born absent a one-child policy and lived in total poverty? Okay. So, you know, and this is valid, you know, that the Chinese, anyone who's ever been to China and spent time with them, this crap about, oh, the Chinese don't care about human life. I mean, no people love their children more than the Chinese. So you have to get rid of that stereotype and maybe look at the big picture and weigh one evil against another evil. You know, the Chinese made a hard choice that it is better to have a policy that is draconian sometimes rather than have a population like India that may become so out of control that it makes the entire economy founder and makes it more and more difficult to sustain anybody. So again, it's not that we're right and they're wrong, it's just that they get miffed when we say, we're right and you're wrong. They want a little more balance. There are many more examples on specific issues that I could talk about if I had more time, but the bottom line is that the Chinese have a sense of hypocrisy, and so it undercuts our moral authority when we focus on something that is very important, and that is human rights. So let me talk about a couple of issues that are contemporary where this sort of comes out. One is in bilateral trade, right? This is an issue that is becoming increasingly important as China as the trade deficit expands, China becomes an economic rival. The United States economy is shaky, and we look for answers, right? Or at least scapegoats. China was in sort of a unique position in trade in that for 25 years, beginning in 1974, it was subject to what was called the Jackson-Vanik Amendment. And basically, this was a time when we still saw China and the Soviet Union as sort of twins. And we developed a policy in the Jackson-Vanik Amendment whereby we tied the renewal of normal trade status with Russia, which was then called Most Favored Nations Trade Status, MFN. We tied that to the Soviet Union's willingness to allow its Jews to emigrate. Okay. For China, which we threw into the basket here, we said that there would be a yearly determination by the President of the United States that there had to be an improvement in human rights if China was to receive an annual renewal of normal trade status. And as someone who worked in intelligence for a number of years sort of tracking this issue, I can tell you that it was a total charade. For 50 weeks out of the year, Chinese leaders would oppress their people, and then 2 weeks before the congressional vote, they would free some very well-known political prisoners, and pressured by the business lobby, the US president would say, "My God, improvement! You've got normal trade status." And then as we chugged along into the next year, all the political prisoners would be quietly rearrested, and we would wait for the next episode of the congressional vote. So given this kind of performance, why would China take US blustering on human rights seriously? I mean, they saw us sort of undercutting our own policy when it was convenient to do so. Another much more recent example is the war on terror. China was deeply concerned about the US invasion of Iraq for the reasons that many of us were concerned. They didn't think that Saddam Hussein was a good guy, but they did not believe that Iraq had nuclear weapons. They feared that an Iraq with no Saddam Hussein would be less stable and more dangerous than a Saddam without any leadership. And they were also disturbed by the war as what they perceived as an extension of a pro-Israeli, anti-Arab policy in the United States that they don't much appreciate. But the Chinese are pragmatic, and they decided to take advantage of America's desperate need to create a coalition of the willing. In this case, a coalition of those who keep their mouths shut. And so what China did with US welcome acquiescence was to refrain from criticizing the US move into Iraq in exchange for a fiction that we were partners in the war on terror. And what this meant in real terms was that we turned a blind eye to China's efforts to fight its Islamic terrorists in Western China. In other words, we gave China a blank check to do whatever it wanted with its Uyghur minority. And, throw in the Tibetans too, if you want. So, how ethical is this? Right? So I've been sort of relentlessly critical of US policy. And in fairness, I should mention one policy that I think was enlightened and did more for political rights in China than anything that I've mentioned so far. And that was the policy that was bolstered by President Bush I to do everything he could from a national policy to help China reform and opened up. And I think that Bush understood and was absolutely right in thinking that anything the United States could do to help economic reform, to open China to foreign visitors, foreign trends, foreign news, and that increased its integration in and dependence on the global community would be a plus. That it would not only make it more difficult for China to go on its own and sort of defy world opinion, but that it would improve the lives of Chinese and thus create the possibility of a civil society. And I think that what fed into this policy being so successful was an assumption by Deng Xiaoping that proved to be critically wrong. Deng Xiaoping came to power in the wake of the Cultural Revolution, which was a period of insanity in China that left the Chinese Communist Party's legitimacy hanging by a tiny string. And what Deng Xiaoping realized, number one, the magnitude of the problem. But his solution was to throw out the Maoist politicization and the mass campaigns and all that crap and just, loosen the leash and help people live better. But his belief was that if we can substantially improve the lives of people in China, that they would be grateful to the Chinese Communist Party. And it turned out they weren't. I mean, Tiananmen was a classic case of a revolution of rising expectations. But this fed into this belief that we have to do everything we can to improve people's lives coincided with the U.S. effort and therefore made it acceptable for China. I mean, it's not like they were babes in the woods. They knew what the United States was doing, and they saw it as okay, given their own goals. So the problem was that instead of begetting Singapore, they begat something that almost overthrew the Chinese Communist Party leadership. So in the wake of Tiananmen, Deng's errors became apparent, and the wisdom of Bush's policy, which the Chinese called peaceful evolution, were revealed. Deng became persona non grata in China for several years after Tiananmen because he was blamed for what happened. Okay. I guess I want to blather on way too long here. I'll sort of close very quickly by saying that whatever the United States policy is toward China in the realm of human rights in particular, we have to remember that it is more important in symbolic than real terms. Because the Chinese, except for the Bush policy, for special conditions, which they agreed to, except for that, I can think of no U.S. policy related to ethics or human rights that the Chinese have cared a whit about. And in fact, they are virtually immune to any pressure from the United States. For the reasons I've mentioned, they don't see us as a creditable critic, but also because they are driven by their own domestic needs. And those needs right now are to deal with a massive army of unemployed, 100 million floating population that they have to worry about, and an astronomical growth in public demonstrations, not necessarily focused against the center, but focused against people who are identified as the authority of the Chinese Communist Party. By China's own acknowledgement, there has been a 20-fold increase in violent demonstrations in the last 5 years. And the leadership is talking about this being a life and death issue. And it's related to a lot of things. The huge and growing gap between the haves and the have-nots in China, the rampant spread of corruption, which is fed in part by the fact that nothing replaced Marxist-Leninism when it left the scene. So the Chinese leadership is petrified now, and no less jealous of guarding its authority than any other Chinese leadership. And the last thing they're going to do is ease up on human rights in a period that they perceive as a crisis. And you see it now that not only are they particularly prickly about human rights when the United States brings it up, but there has been a new campaign, a new crackdown against the media and the bravest of China's human rights advocates. So despite a young leadership for which we had great hope, things are much worse in China than they've been for some time. I should say, though, that China is so much better now than Taiwan was when we saw it as a democratic ally. It isn't funny. I mean, in private, especially if you speak Chinese, Chinese will tell you anything. And this was one of the things, one of the deals that Deng Xiaoping made. You know, if we want to be prosperous economically, we cannot expect you to be an automaton the rest of the time. And so he returned to China the freedom of private discussion. And so if you talk to Chinese, you know, they will be absolutely candid about what they think. Pre-Tiananmen, it was like being in New York when they lost to the Red Sox. I mean, people were pissed, and they would tell you anything. I mean, they called her these corrupt, insane, you know, senile, horrible. It was the United States rulers that were so great. Our problem is that we have squandered the goodwill we've had in the pre- and Tiananmen period among China's young elite. And we did that through a miscalculation by George Bush. And now I'll mention this and I'll shut up. And that is, there was mutual disgust in the United States and among the young people of China when Tiananmen was suppressed. And the United States Congress and the United States people wanted us to isolate and punish the people who had suppressed the Tiananmen movement. Instead, within a week of the suppression of Tiananmen, the United States government was making secret contact with Deng Xiaoping and other Chinese leaders, keeping open the lines of communication. And I know why Bush did it, because he saw a real danger that China would lapse into the bad old days of the Maoist period of anti-reform, you know, pulling out of its global commitments, and he wanted to keep them engaged. But when the Chinese people found out about this, especially their young people, the special status that the United States had as a democratic nation, as a symbol, just went bye-bye. Instead, they saw us as just like China. You know, you say one thing, and you're always talking out of the side of your mouth. So we lost that generation, which was a pity. And we haven't won them back because of policies like the Iraq War, which is massively unpopular among the Chinese people. So I talked way too long and I left out some other stuff. So let's just, one final note. The premise of this is that we should look for creating a just and ethical and sustainable future 15 years hence. And I think if we are committed to doing that, that we have to be very careful about what we seem to be doing with China now. And that is changing it from a rival to an enemy. And this is done in a series of issues like trade, like the evaluation of the yuan, which, if you look at these issues, China is more right than we are. And if you want to talk about it, I'd be happy to do that. But we tend to be looking to China as something to blame issues where we should be looking in the mirror and at least sharing blame. And I'm really concerned that if we have a self-fulfilling prophecy whereby we make China into the next great enemy. Instead, I think we should be looking at issues in a sane, unemotional way and doing everything we can to sustain what I see as a very constructive global engagement policy being carried out by China at the moment. Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate it. Questions? Yes.
In the Chinese involvement in the North Korea situation, they probably weren't motivated by ethics, but to get them involved, you know what we gave them?
We gave them nothing because it was in their self-interest not to put North Korea on a ledge. Chinese are deeply concerned that they don't want a nuclear environment in North Korea, but they also don't want an economic collapse that will send tens of millions of North Koreans over the Chinese border. And so, you know, while we were busy in Iraq, we were at least sane enough to tell the Chinese, you know, we will support you in any constructive dialogue that you engage in. And it was sort of our stupidity that we were so ideological about this axis of evil stuff that we not only created ill will with our allies in East Asia, including the Chinese, but we made things worse. I mean, a lot of Americans like the bluster of U.S. policy toward North Korea because we're standing up to those guys. The reality is that the progress we had been making toward denuclearization in China halted, and they started to escalate production of nuclear weapons. So it was wrong. And now we got sort of miffed at the Chinese because in this vacuum that we created when we weren't talking to North Korea, they started to become more strategically prominent. So you can't have it both ways. Yes?
There are groups pushing now for President Bush to encourage the Chinese leader to meet with the Dalai Lama and discuss conditions in Tibet. Do you think there's any possibility he might actually do this?
Might be. Hu Jintao, China's new leader, knowing that he's in the midst of a crackdown, is trying to do things to sort of refurbish his image. And one of them, ironically, is sort of, what's the word for when you take a political enemy and you bring him back? Rehabilitate. Thank you. He's trying to rehabilitate Hu Yaobang, whose death precipitated Tiananmen. So I can see talks with the Dalai Lama as being sort of this, symbolic showcase things that he might consider, knowing that they will lead absolutely nowhere because he won't let them. So I would say, it'd be nice if he does deign to talk to the Dalai Lama, but I would be amazed if anything concrete came out of it, just because it rubs against the areas where they're most paranoid. Independence movements. If Tibet goes, forget it. There's Taiwan, Xinjiang, Hong Kong. It's too evil and dangerous a precedent. Any other questions? Criticisms? Yes.
I just wanted, your last point is, how close do you think we are, or, how precarious is our situation from turning China into an enemy?
Well, I think the administration policy is still very rational. Where I see the danger is in Congress. There are at least 3 bills, all of which are illegal in terms of our World Trade Organization agreement, where China would be the subject of draconian sort of trade sanctions if they don't do what we want. Like on the yuan, we want China to devalue by like 20 to 25%. If they do that, their whole economy stalls. All these unemployed, things get worse. So they can't really do that. Instead, they've tied their currency, which used to be pegged to the dollar, to a basket of currencies, many of which are stronger than the dollar. So the yuan has only devalued 2.5%. But we have said if they don't unilaterally change the value by 25%, we will declare them a currency manipulator and raise tariffs to 27%. So, this doesn't look at the reality. I mean, the reality is that the United States never said peep when the dollar was strong and the yuan was weak and we were making hay. Nor it also ignores the fact that we were also pressuring China to devalue during the Asian financial crisis, and had they done that, all of Asia would have collapsed. Instead, the Chinese economy stayed strong. It helped sort of bolster the rest of the continent, and it came out more quickly than we feared. So on one hand, the Chinese don't trust our judgment, but they also know that it's very political. But this is a case where I think we are inclined to use them as a scapegoat. Trade deficit, I mean, this is very complicated, and I'll just mention it because it is parallel. That the majority of the surplus that China has with the United States comes from exports from companies that are owned by the United States, like Nike, Japan, Taiwan, and South Korea. And if you look at the exports from China-owned manufacturing facilities, they're negligible. I mean, what China makes out of this is jobs and creation and investment. So, I think that's a much more complicated issue than we portray it. And yet, we have Congressman Schumer and other people also vowing sanctions against China. I mean, devastating sanctions that could lead to a trade war even though they are illegal. So I see the Congress as the wild card.
Okay.
Yes, Karen.
It was interesting you started with the sympathetic pictures of China in the American media and sort of psyche. It seems like we're seeing a different, more of a
Yeah.
dehumanization now. I guess maybe Taiwan is the good guy again. And I'm thinking about the Robert Kaplan article that came out a couple
Mhm.
weeks ago in Atlantic. Don't you think the Chinese have become sort of country?
Yeah, we liked them when they were weak and cuddly. You know, I think it's inevitable. I mean, it's sort of a redo of what happened with Japan. They became the economic juggernaut, you know, and we became fearful. And you know, there's a lot of that, and you know, it's a very natural tendency at a time when things aren't going so great here to have those fears magnified. But I think you're absolutely right. On a personal level, though, not much has changed. I mean, as you know, you've spoken to our Chinese visitors here, and they've gotten a wonderful reception. And I think one of the aspects of U.S.-China relations is that people on both sides tend to separate people from their government. You know, thank God they do that with us. But I think we do too. People have been astonishingly nice to our trainees, and that's sort of consistent. But I'm glad you pointed that out because that's an important aspect of this.
Well, it's 1 o'clock. Let's thank Terry for this great.
Thank you all for coming.